Hi everyone, welcome to this FSSC webinar on food loss and waste. My name is Ati van Olst, I'm FSSC's Marketing and Communications Director. And let me start to introduce you to the keynote speakers of today. Here in the studio we have Aldin Hilbrands. He is our CEO of FSSC. Also in the studio we have John Niederer. He is the environmental specialist of FrieslandCampina, Royal FrieslandCampina. Then we have joining online from South Africa, Kelly Mulholland. She's FSSC's Technical Manager, Food Safety and Quality. Yes, Aldin will kick off with his presentation on explaining why Foundation FSSC decided to include food loss and waste as part of our new version 6 of FSSC's certification scheme for food safety management systems, FSSC 22000. Then he will hand over to Kelly, who will talk about the specific scheme requirements on food loss and waste, and she'll also introduce you to FSSC's guidance document on food loss and waste. Then we switch back to the studio, where John Niederer will explain why FrieslandCampina takes reducing food loss and waste very seriously, and how the FSSC 20000 scheme requirements can support them in their policy. Then we will have a Q&A session. And feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A tool as part of this webinar, because you're all muted. This webinar will be recorded, and both the recording and the presentations will be shared with you through email after the webinar. Now, let's start with this webinar. Aldin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ati. Very delighted to be here to talk about the important topic of food loss and waste that we added to our 22000 version 6 of the scheme. And this is my first time in the studio, so I'm glad to be with Ati, John and Kelly online to discuss this. And let me introduce you first about the background to this. So here is in an infographic a display of who we are, what we do. So the most important reason why we added food loss and waste is because our global vision is that we want to be part of creating a better world. Underneath you see our promise to the world, our mission statement, which shows that we want to lead, show leadership on different fronts, as a scheme owner, as a management system scheme owner, that is providing trust and delivering impact to the world in the wider consumer goods industry. And how we do that is through our schemes. We have a 22000 food safety management system scheme, very successful. We've become the largest in the world in this area by now. We introduced, as some of you might know, a new scheme, 24000, which is more looking at the social sustainability, so how people are treated in the supply chain when they produce these nice food products. Then in the middle, this is about our assurance activities. That means our oversight on everybody involved in the auditing and certification of organizations around the world in relation to our schemes. And on the right side, you see an improvement pillar. And this is how we feel we should be part of continually helping the improvement of the supply chain and as such create that better world. Our values are at the bottom. This is our DNA. This is who we are. Then I'll go to the next slide. Food loss and waste. Why is this such a very important topic? Well, to zoom out, what is actually the size of the problem we're talking about? And I've put a couple of pointers here. One is we're looking at a growing world population. At the moment, we have about 8 billion people in the world. By 2030, the prediction is 8.5 billion, and by 2050, even 10 billion people. And still, hunger since 2014 is slowly but steadily rising. And that is, of course, a big concern, should be a big concern to all of us. And at the same time, if you look at food being produced in supply chains, 1/3 is lost across the entire supply chain. From farming, if you look at the bottom, the pictorial representation, farm level until all the way at the right end, the retail, and the last step is the consumer's household. That is huge in terms of quantity. We're talking about 1 billion metric tons of food, which represents $1 trillion loss per year. And essentially, with all that food that we lose, we could be feeding 2 billion people, and we could be ending the world hunger problem. If you translate that to what that means in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, if you think about climate, global warming, it is caused by 8% of all the human-caused emissions, that lost food, which is tremendous. So essentially, food loss and waste is undermining food system sustainability. And as part of our current discussions in the world, in Dubai on COP28, this is a thing that is again being discussed. And we also need to show that we should be helping with the tools that we have to try and be part of the solution. Now, what are the drivers on this slide? I've tried to indicate the drivers to food loss and waste. On the left, there's direct drivers. On the right, you see indirect drivers. So focusing a little bit on the direct drivers, it is obviously, different practices in the supply chain. Implementing best practice is really important to make sure we minimize food loss and waste. There are some more factors that sometimes are beyond our control. Biological and environmental factors, climate, soil, some things is difficult to influence from our side, but I just set the boundaries in terms of efficient production. Technological infrastructure, like how do we build a facility? How do we build design equipment to make sure that we can properly clean it? That is, I think, also what needs focusing on more. On the right-hand side, there's human factors. So how well are people trained to implement the best practice? What's the culture in a business? Is there enough attention for this topic? Another reason why we added it to our scheme. And at the bottom end, this is also where we come in, market structure, governance, investment, fair trade. What is the role of standards there? So we have a role to play. We added it to our version 6 of the scheme. So there's also a role for us to play here as an indirect driver and trying to be helpful in having a positive impact on this topic. Well, if you zoom out, what is the goal essentially that we want to achieve by focusing on food loss and waste? Well, in our opinion, ultimately food loss and waste is pretty much a raw material efficiency discussion. So we, with our 22,000 scheme, we want to help and enable companies to maximize human food production. So in our vision, that means minimizing food loss and waste. So it's two sides of the same coin, and this is why we added it. This is not necessarily conflicting, but it is complementary to each other. The pathway towards improving food loss and waste is merely trying to look at impacting global food security. My previous slide, if we do the right thing, we make a lot more food available to people that need it. Reducing economic costs, I'm sure John will also talk about it from a business perspective. If we do the right thing, this is not just a sustainability issue from a social and environmental standpoint. It is also about, adding value in terms of making more money and being more efficient in the way we produce food. Reducing the environmental impact, I talked about the reduction that we could potentially achieve in the greenhouse gas emissions. And last but not least, there is also emerging legislation that is focusing on food loss and waste. To start with, here in Europe on the Green Deal, this is in the pipeline, and this will help companies to prepare for also meeting legal requirements. And I'm sure in other parts of the world, that will also come at some point in time and become a binding, say, requirement to continue to stay in business. Now, I'd like to jump to United Nations Global Compact. This is why I put this picture in here. Some of you might know that we became a member of the United Nations Global Compact in 2021. That essentially has forced us to think about how we can achieve impact. And that is essentially looking at how we can make the difference in terms of impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. You can see them here in this slide. And we have been discussing, first learning for ourselves in what is this all about? How can we make a difference? And what would be the SDGs that we probably could have the biggest impact on as a scheme owner with a growing amount of food businesses that are trying to also help us to make the world a little better. And well, I would like to highlight SDG number 12, that is responsible production and consumption, linked very much to the food waste topic. And there's a specific SDG on the 12.3 that's looking at halving food loss and waste by 2030. So that's an important one in this context to look at. And we as a scheme owner, we contribute to more than one SDG. I put that on this slide here. We did research. Every year we do some projects with the Wageningen University. So with some young graduates, we come up with a topic for a Master of Science thesis. And the last one showed us that our impact is in particular in the areas of SDG number 1, 3, 8, 12, and 17. And food loss was deemed to be the largest impact area for us by the experts that were interviewed. And in particular, 12.3 is looking at that halving of food waste reduction by 2030. So one of the reasons we added it to version 6 is because of this research, because of a survey that we have conducted before we started writing up version 6, and ultimately because we as a scheme owner believe we have to also show to everything that we do that we can truly help the world and the companies that use our certification to make the world a better place. So last but not least, in kind of a summary, we feel this is doing the right thing. Like I said, creating the better world, leading by example to provide trust and impact. We have a growing amount of businesses that use us. I think at the moment we are at least over 30,000 food manufacturing operations globally that are bound to implement our new food loss and waste requirements that Kelly will be shortly discussing in much more detail with you. And yes, we focus on helping progressing SDG 12.3. We know from a global standpoint that United Nations has recently shown we are all of us together. We are behind on making progress. So we have to scale up. We're trying to help to scale this up to maximize impact, and we have to go faster. So we have to do a better job at a faster pace. Otherwise, we cannot guarantee a bright future for our children, which, from my standpoint, is not good enough. So this is my kind of setting the scene. So thank you for now, and I'm very happy, Kelly, that I'm handing the virtual stick, over to you in Cape Town. So I hope you can hear us and please can enlighten us on the new 22,000 version 6 requirements around food loss and waste. Kelly, over to you now.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Aldin, and thanks also for setting the scene and explaining why we feel so strongly about the reduction of food loss and waste. So as mentioned during my session of the webinar today, I'll be looking at the version 6 scheme requirements on food loss and waste, and I'll also be having a look at the guidance document that we've put together. So we'll start off by having a look at that scheme requirement. So the additional requirement on food loss and waste included under Part 2 of the scheme, so Section 2.5.16, is applicable to all food chain categories except for Category I for packaging manufacturing. So the requirement relates to food loss and waste in that organizations need to have a documented policy and objectives detailing the organization's strategy to reduce their food loss and waste within their organization, as well as within the related supply chain that they have control over. Organizations are also required to have controls in place to manage products that they donate to not-for-profit organizations, to employees, or to other organizations, whilst making sure that these products are still safe for consumption. And in addition, organizations need to manage surplus products or byproducts intended as animal feed to prevent contamination of these products as well. And lastly, the processes that are implemented by the organization needs to still comply with applicable legislation. It needs to be kept up to date. And then very importantly, the implementation of these requirements shall not have a negative impact on food safety either. On this slide, for some of you who may have attended our version 6 webinar, you might have seen this as well with regards to an example that we've put together relating to food loss and waste, an objective for food loss and waste. So in this example, it's that the organization would look to reduce the organization's food loss and waste by 10% year on year, with an overall reduction of 50%, for example, over the next 5-year period. Again, this is just an example, but it also aligns with what Aldin mentioned with regards to halving food loss and waste by 2030. Then next, when we have a look at the guidance document that we've published. So we published a guidance document in October of this year, and it is for organizations on how to implement these requirements of food loss and waste within the food safety management system. And I'll now take you through some of this guidance in a little bit more detail. So in accordance with the additional requirement 2.5.16a, the organization is required to have the documented policy and strategy to reduce food loss and waste, including targets and objectives. And in order to establish this strategy, an organization can implement a 3-step approach. So it's a 3-step process, and this is what we've included in our guidance document. So it starts off by having a look at step 1, which is setting a target, step 2, undertaking measurement, and step 3, taking action. So we're first going to have a look at step 1. So looking at the target. The first part of the step is to quantify food loss and waste currently generated by your organization and the supply chain that your organization has control over. And this is undertaken in order to establish a baseline or a base year quantity of food loss and waste for your organization. In order to do this, the organization should establish the scope of the food loss and waste by identifying the different types of food loss and waste generated within their organization at each step. So at each step within their production process, from procurement through to processing, packing, storage, or distribution, as well as steps in their supply chain that they have control over. Next, the organization should establish the time period over which they want to quantify their current food loss and waste in order to set up a baseline. So the organization should look to calculate and quantify the current food loss and waste for each type of food waste that the organization generates. And in relation to quantification, the organization needs to determine the quantification unit that they will use in their quantification. So for example, this could be weight in kilograms, volume in liters, the relevant currency of the country. So for example, euros if based in the Netherlands, or the organization could look to quantify in environmental impact. Okay, so the environmental impact of their food loss and waste, such as by the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. Then the organization needs to determine what current processes they have in place to manage food loss and waste that's generated by the organization. And it's also important that the organization investigates the root causes of their current food loss and waste, and then determines ways that they can address this. So then the organization needs to have a look at B on this slide, which is to establish a prevention plan, which includes the organization's food loss and waste objectives. So their targets and objectives. So to do this, the organization needs to decide which type of food loss and waste they generate they will be focusing on as focus areas, taking into account the type of food loss and waste, the quantities, as well as the value of the food loss and waste generated. When the organization sets the objectives and the targets for these food loss and wastes types, the organization also needs to consider setting both short-term and long-term objectives. So short-term being annual or quarterly objectives, and long-term being over a 5 or 10-year period. The objectives and targets set may be internally established by the organization, or it could be based on regulations or industry association targets. So it's important that the organization takes into account whether the government or local authority where their organization is based has set standards or targets relating to the reduction of food loss and waste. And if so, then the organization should look to align with these requirements. The organization also needs to define actions to be taken to reduce the food loss and waste per type. And when defining these actions, you also need to include the responsibilities for implementing these actions, what resources are required, the timeframes that you're setting for completion, and also what aspects of the food safety management system may need to be updated. So the actions implemented by the organization should look to, firstly, prevent food loss and waste from occurring, rescue food for donation, or redistribute the food loss and waste to other destinations. So when we have a look at the next slide, this slide has a look at some of those destinations that I spoke about when I say that we need to consider redistribution of the food loss and waste to other destinations. So destinations include sending waste, for example, for animal feed production, thereby diverting the food loss and waste material from the supply chain to animals, or bio-based material or biochemical processing, thereby converting the food loss and waste material into other industrial products for other uses. Co-digestion or anaerobic digestion, which breaks down that food loss and waste material by bacteria, generating biogas or other nutrient-rich matter for other uses. There are also other destinations that can be seen on the slide now, and you can see this also within the guidance document. And this includes sending the food loss and waste material for composting or controlled combustion or land application. So there are other destinations other than landfill. So the figure on this slide is the food waste permit, and it was developed by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, and it outlines the most preferable solutions to address food loss and waste. So the ideal solution being prevention and reduction at the top of the permit, or the reverse permit, followed by repurposing and recycling, and lastly, recovery and then disposal at the bottom. So the intent is to move the waste up the hierarchy, such as waste currently sent to a disposal destination, which is shown in red at the bottom, should be investigated to determine whether there are solutions to move the waste up to recovery, recycling, or optimization destinations, or potentially preventing the food loss and waste from occurring in the first instance. Next, we're going to have a look at the second step in this three-step process, and that is measure. So in this step, the organization needs to define monitoring procedures to measure food loss and waste against the baseline or base year that's been set. And this needs to be done the monitoring needs to be done at defined regular intervals. So the organization needs to define those intervals. And the organization needs to determine the causes for the food loss and waste. The monitoring and measurement needs to be done at those defined intervals using, again, a defined methodology, which needs to be suitable for your organization. During the monitoring, the organization also needs to monitor the current destination of the food loss and waste material in order to look to see if it can be moved up that food and drink hierarchy. And then the organization needs to evaluate the results to determine whether the objective and target have been achieved or not. When we look at step 3 in this process, this is action. So where it has been identified that the target has not been met, the organization needs to investigate and determine the causes for this not being met, and then implement suitable actions to address this. Whilst in B, where it has been met, the organization should still evaluate the current quantity of food loss and waste, as well as the destination, and to determine whether further reductions are possible and whether another feasible destination could have a larger sustainable impact. Thus, investigate whether further reductions can be made by moving it up that hierarchy. So that was the 3-step process that we just wanted to make you aware of, which is within our guidance document. So now I'm going to give you some general guidance in relation to food loss and waste. In the context of the scheme, food loss and waste only relates to food. It doesn't include packaging material wastage, and therefore the weight of the packaging material should be excluded from the measurement of food loss and waste. However, keep in mind that edible packaging is still considered to be food and therefore needs to be included. Food loss and waste includes both food intended for human and animal consumption, including ingredients, additives, drinks, pet food, and also includes the associated inedible parts of the food. So let's just explain a little bit further what do we mean by inedible parts. So in relation to inedible parts of the food, this is referring to, for example, the shell of an egg or the peel of a banana. These parts are referred to as inedible parts of the foodstuff, as they're not generally consumed. Organizations should still consider these inedible parts as part of their food loss and waste, as instead of automatically sending these inedible parts to a landfill, the organization could rather investigate other destinations for that these inedible parts could be used in, such as co-digestion. So the requirement also includes, within the scheme, it also includes for safe and wholesome food rescued or recovered and donated to charities, so supplied to a secondary market to feed people. So if you have a look at our requirement as well as our guidance document, there is some requirements in place in relation to the management of donations, as well as some guidance within the guidance document on the management thereof. Okay, then for some further guidance, some further general guidance, where products don't meet quality parameters in line with your organization's finished product specifications, you should look for alternative markets in order to prevent the products from being disposed of. Organizations should also look at ways to improve efficiencies to reduce the amount of product that needs to be downgraded due to not meeting the quality specification, such as by putting in place measures to assess the amount of product that your organization currently has to downgrade or send to waste, and see what target could be set to reduce this. You should also review the shelf life that your organization has established for your products to assess whether the shelf life is still correct or whether the shelf life of the products could be increased and still be consumption. And then lastly, on the general guidance, effective stock rotation such as first in, first out or first expired, first out is also vital in reducing food loss and waste as well. Now, within our guidance document, we have also included some specific guidance, which I won't go into detail during this webinar, but we've included some specific guidance for catering and food service organizations, retailers and wholesalers, brokers and traders, as well as for transport and storage organizations and biochemical or chemical or biochemical manufacturing organizations as well. So please do go and review these sections of the guidance document for further information, as it's very useful information, so we really do recommend that you have a look at it. And then in addition to this sector-specific guidance, the guidance document also includes guidance for the management of donated product and on the management of surplus products or byproducts intended as animal feed. So please do go and have a look at those as well for some further information. Okay, and then onto my last section. Under section 8 of the guidance documents, you will find that there's a section titled Related Industry Information. It's not an exhaustive list, and it is for information purposes only and may not apply to all organizations. However, this section includes a wide range of resources for organizations to consider when they are establishing their food loss and waste strategy. And we recommend that you make use of them, especially when you're starting your journey on your food loss and waste journey. So on that note, I hope you found this session useful and that your food loss and waste journey will be a successful one. And I'll now hand back over to the studio to Ati for the next part of today's webinar. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for your extensive explanation of the requirements and also taking us through the guidance documents. Let's hand over now to John, here with us in the studio, on a FrieslandCampina perspective on food loss and waste.
Thank you, Ati, and thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts on how we practically attack this problem within FrieslandCampina. Perhaps very quickly first, what is FrieslandCampina? FrieslandCampina is a dairy cooperative based in the Netherlands. We have about 15,000 member farmers based in the Netherlands, Belgium and Germany. And we process about 9,500 million kilograms of milk a year and some 14 odd billion euros revenue per year. We export to about 100 countries. So in the dairy business, we're not the largest, but we're a fairly decent sized cooperative. Perhaps quickly setting the scene. As I just mentioned, we process about 9,500 million kilograms of milk, but obviously we do not have a 100% yield. Our plants typically have 97-ish% yields, which is fairly decent, but still there's a lot of loss en route from the farmers to our factories, via sales and distribution, to the retail and consumer market. And there you see that we're still using large amounts of both starting material, but also end product. As they're shown, the 9,500 million kilograms, if you would only lose 1% of that amount, I recalculated that to cheese. If you would take a Gouda cheese wheel of about 35 centimeters, with 1% loss, you could make a line of cheese between Brussels and Paris. And that's a fairly decent amount of product lost. And again, that's only 1%, and we're actually losing a bit more. We had the University of Wageningen make an assessment of both our product losses, but also euro and CO2 losses. And as you can see, we're talking really significant amounts of money and CO2 as well. Just to give you a very quick heads up, the amounts of CO2 here include the amounts of CO2 produced at the farm. So it is the actual total amount of CO2 in milk. So the numbers might seem a bit high for a couple of our viewers, but that's the reason for the somewhat higher numbers. What kind of food losses and waste do we typically have? And I'm going to show you a couple of very pragmatic examples. Obviously we have start-stop losses. The cut-offs of an evaporator, a spray dryer, simply causes losses. Then you have losses because of cleaning, because part of the material will simply remain on the unit operation, and that's a loss. We have byproducts, for example, the permeate from membrane filtrations, or the leftover minerals from demineralization steps, the mother liquor from crystallization. Those are all large amounts of byproducts. Other ones can be out-of-spec products. Obviously, as already mentioned, shelf life out-of-date material is also a loss, etc. Now, at FrieslandCampina, we are trying to develop a holistic approach. You should look at it throughout the complete supply chain, and you should have a look at it not only per product, but also what can you do with what you have left over, what is off spec, etc. So a holistic approach. As said, I'm going to show you a couple of very practical and very pragmatic methods with which we have started over the last years to decrease our product loss, and obviously with that attached, increase our profitability. Because, to put it very blunt, there's a large amount of money to be made here. A first example I would like to show you is on the prevention of waste, and that is very simply ensure a first-time right production. Now, that might sound fairly trivial, but experience learns that when a customer comes in, or when our product development has thought of a new product, then it is not completely trivial in producing the product, actually completely 100% in spec, on time, etc. There are always minor issues. For example, a flow meter might be applicable to 100 cubes an hour, but if one of the components will be significantly less, then that mass flow meter might not be fit for purpose, and then you have to change your process. How then do you go about determining what you need to do / ensuring an always in-spec production? We're now developing a methodology to ensure that that is the case, and with that we use as input for that process the feedstock variations, and obviously we'll have different feedstocks with each their own variation. You need to take into account the analysis method variation, and that sounds trivial, but it is definitely not. There is a very interesting paper by Konings from 2 years ago in food control, where a number of our competitors and ourselves had a look at various minor component chemical analysis methods, for example vitamins, and they showed that several of the methods we need to use from a legal point of view, for example from GB, the Chinese organization, simply will give you a certain amount of out of spec. A worst case one would be you would lose 19% of first time right, simply because the analysis method is not all that brilliant and will cause out of spec. And then finally, of course, you need to take into account the process variation, which we do by having a look at capability analyses. And as an example, I've shown here a bit of feedstock variation and a bit of product variation over time, over a year, and you can see there can be a large amount of variation. Now, how do we go about this? We typically use measurement system analyses, process capability studies, control charts, and while having a look at all this data, we can predict in advance it will be possible to produce this new product within specification, or we will know in advance there is a risk of having perhaps 5% out of spec. And then you can take that into account in a cost pricing. That would be the very pragmatic way. On the other hand side, you can then also decide, hang on, if we change a mass flow meter, our out of spec will decrease to perhaps 1%. And then you have a very pragmatic way of preventing waste here. Also, perhaps a couple of examples on waste reduction. Those we typically use for existing products and existing production lines. What are important ones? And I'm going to kick in a couple of open doors. But it is still worthwhile realizing that these are important. It starts by preventive maintenance. It starts with having your system up and running. It starts with having your sensors calibrated. For example, if you do not have a well-calibrated sensor, you might have issues in your PID control loop system. A couple of years back, I had a quick chat with a professor of process control, and his estimate was that between 25% and 50% of all PID control loop settings are not completely fit for purpose. And that will cause issues in processing. So it is well worthwhile, by simply looking at all these various types of control systems, to improve your first time right. Other tools might be process control charts, product control charts. Obviously, when there's an issue in a plant, we will set up root cause analysis teams for process technological and product issues. Another example of a very nice methodology to reduce first time right issues in a plant is Lean Six Sigma. In the past, what we used to do, we would send a couple of colleagues to a Lean Six Sigma black belt training. They would do their project, come back into the plant, and then essentially everybody would forget that we had trained somebody in Lean Six Sigma black belt, they would go to a different position, and we would not use them optimally. In 2017, we changed to a completely different methodology. We started with a couple of black belts, and we have started to train a large amount of Lean Six Sigma green belts. At the moment, we've got about 80 people trained as certified green belt. We still have people in training, and we continue to do so. We started with technologists, but we're now also training QC people, supply chain people, and that improves our first time right, our process control, not only of plants, but also our process control in the supply chain significantly. And payback is very decent. We have already saved several tens of millions of euros, so it is actually worthwhile. Plus the spin-off of having all those people trained and knowing what they're talking about gives them the opportunity to use all these different techniques in having a quick look at an issue. People really use the methodology, and it is really worth a lot of money. Another one that is definitely worthwhile, and I just mentioned the paper by Konings, is have a look at your QC systems. Are you sure that all your analytical methods are fit for purpose? In all those Lean Six Sigma projects I just mentioned, one of the steps is a gauge R&R to have a look if you can actually see a difference when you change something in the process. And surprisingly, there is a fairly decent amount of analytical measurements which are not actually fit for purpose. And if you know this, you can either improve your method or change to a completely different method. Thus, you improve your process control, your product control, and reduce your off-spec. Another one that we're currently looking into as well, and this is partially driven simply by improving cash flow. Yeah, do we actually need, if you have a good analysis method available, do we actually need these very large amounts of analyses after production or in production? When you do a capability study on the analysis frequency, you see that we're essentially over-analyzing. And although it is only a minor amount of waste, if you put it all together, financially it's a very interesting one, because all those people still have to do all these analyses. And it will also help in improving your product capability. Now, as a last couple of examples, what do we typically do with waste valorization? Yeah, the most simple one is obviously an end-of-pipe solution. When there's something off-spec, you can always have a look, can I sell it to a different customer? It's a stupid method, but it works. That's cherry picking. Another one, you could choose to downgrade your product if you have bits and pieces of leftover cheese. Yeah, there's nothing wrong by using that as an input for grated cheese. Perhaps a more nice one is waste valorization. And just a couple of examples. What we typically do with start-stop powder from spray dryers, that is used as feedstock for feed. Another one is the leftovers from our crystallization process for the production of pharma lactose, that is also sent to feed producers. And thus we simply earn money without waste, and that's worthwhile. Perhaps a more interesting one is the last one to this account is, let's say, an upgrade to something worth more money. We have a couple of products in our portfolio where we upgrade our mineral waste, which we produce from the production of ingredients mainly for infant food, and often contains a large amount of minerals. For example, we produce milk calcium, which is a colloidal calcium phosphate solution, which can be used to increase calcium and phosphate contents in, for example, milk. Another example is NaPhos, sodium phosphate, which also is a colloidal solution and which can be used in wastewater treatment plants. And as last ones, supply chain, obviously, yeah, we do catastrophe aid, we provide materials to food banks, etc. Where are we at the moment with FrieslandCampina within the FSSC 22000? Well, we're starting with implementing everything. I've shown you a couple of examples. A number of things are running for a couple of years now. Other ones we're now developing. We're starting in the documentation policy and in our objectives, but we're very good in our compliance of our processes. And we're about halfway in the controls to manage product donations and manage surplus of byproducts. How does the FSSC help us? Yeah, obviously it provides us with focus. It provides us with help. It provides us with perhaps a bit of a benchmark where we can compare and learn from other partners as well. So it is definitely worthwhile participating in FSSC. Some final concluding remarks. Yeah, generally in race production, you need to have a holistic approach to it, and there's never one easy solution. You always need to have a look at the complete process and be creative about what you can do with your materials, especially in food waste programs. The other one is optimization and problem-solving problems often have a waste reduction spin-off. So all these Lean Six Sigma programs really pay off. But again, there's no one-size-fits-all. And a very important one for management to take away, gentlemen, there's actual financial payback. So it is definitely worthwhile pursuing this idea.
Thanks, John, for this practical explanation and this practical business case. It adds a lot of value to our more theoretical approach. So I'm glad that you are here with us in the studio. Okay, so let's continue with the Q&A session. We've received a couple of questions through the Q&A tool, or the questions, and now we will try to answer as many as possible of them. Kelly, I'm afraid that most of them are for you, so be prepared. The first one, how will the compliance of food loss and waste be measured or assessed during the audit?
Great, thanks very much, Ati. It's a really good question. So maybe just to start off by mentioning that the intent of the strategy is to, in the first instance, have the strategy defined. So the organization would need to have defined their strategy, and the auditor would check to see, have they defined that strategy, and is this reflected in their objectives as well? So the starting point would be their operations. They'd also need to look at expanding it into a more holistic approach on a longer term. So the strategy content and the timelines would also need to be decided on by the organization, but the auditor would still check to see that have they established those objectives, have they established those timelines, have they defined them. An example of a finding would be, for instance, where there's no documented policy in place, or where the organization has not defined their objectives, for example.
Thanks a lot, Kelly. And a bit related to this one, could you give an indication of how much time an auditor should dedicate to audit compliance against the food loss and waste requirements?
It's a really great question again, Ati. Again, it's going to depend on the size of the organization. It's going to depend on the extent of the food loss and waste strategy that's implemented by the organization. So giving a defined time frame isn't something that we can just say it would be 1 hour or it would be 2 hours. It would depend on the organization and their strategy and what's been developed.
Okay, thanks a lot. Aldin, back to the studio again. I think you already said a lot about it, but there's a question from Ayesha. She's curious to know why Foundation FSSC decided to include the food loss and waste requirements, within a food safety scheme. FSSC 22000, of course, is a food safety scheme. How does the addition connect to ensuring food safety?
Right, yeah, also a very good question. Great that we have so many questions in the first place. We want to make this very interactive. So I would say, why did we add this is in the first place, because we are a scheme owner that wants to make a difference in the world. We have a clear vision and mission that I outlined earlier in the presentation. This is what we stand for. We are different and we want to make a difference. And in order to be able to make a difference, we associate ourselves very much with the United Nations Global Compact. They've defined the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's one specific, very smart SDG, that is SDG 12.3. And that is really looking at globally focusing on this huge challenge, I would say. And it is an opportunity at the same time. Because we can try and do more and do better. And I think we, as nowadays the largest food safety certification scheme owner globally, we have to show leadership. So we have to bring scale and speed to this issue. In conjunction with leading companies like Friesland here at the table with us, show the vision, implement it, help companies to do the right thing and make the world a better place. So I think that is the main driver that we have. We feel this is the right thing to do. Plus, it also helps companies to comply with emerging legislation. It would help even companies that have, many large companies have nowadays very clear climate commitments, right? Reducing the global warming problem. If we reduce food waste, that would also help, you know, driving down the number of greenhouse gas emissions that, you know, we cause because we do not control or manage this topic well enough. So I would say there's multiple reasons why we've done it. But this would be, well, in a nutshell, hopefully the person that asked the question is not convinced that this was the right move. And maybe, John, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Well, it is directly in line with one of our corporate items, such as we want to provide reliable and safe food to our customers. And this is directly in line with that target.
Thanks a lot for both your comments. Perhaps I can address this question to you, John, because I don't know which standards FrieslandCampina does have in place, but a question from Beatrice. Does an organization already certified according to environmental and sustainable standards also needs to be compliant to this new requirements? Or, put it in a different way, can the organization use the environmental health and safety policy and objectives as part of other standards, drive the food loss and waste requirements that are part of FSSC 22000?
Perhaps first, the first question. Yes, we participate in a couple of different ones. One I would like to mention is On the Way to Planet Proof, which we founded ourselves, if I recall correctly, partially as well. So yes, we participate in a number. FSSC is an example. The other question, why would this be worthwhile? Well, first perhaps the very cynical one, business-wise. Several of our customers, for example, Nestlé, Danone, simply pay us to be more sustainable. So it is from a financial point of view and business point of view simply worthwhile doing so. Besides the whole discussion, we want to do this ourselves as well, because we're not blind. We also see that you need to do things to become more sustainable. This program is aimed at food waste and at food improvement, but we also do a lot of work in CO2 reduction, in water reduction, and actually we have plans in place for the 2030 goals and the 2050 goals to meet all those requirements, because we are part of the society and you need to go ahead with the complete society. So yes, definitely we will participate and will continue to also take the lead and stuff.
Great, that's a great answer. Kelly, getting back to you with a technical question. For the first audit on version 6, is it adequate to demonstrate just the policy? Because the plant would not have data on the targets and no tracking will be available.
So yes, they'd need to have a policy in place, but they'd also need to have defined some form of strategy, some form of target, whether it's just the initial target, like we gave an example earlier of saying you want to, in the first year, look at a 10% reduction. So in that time, you can start working out your baseline and setting a target, but you would need to have some form of strategy and some form of target set.
Thanks a lot. Another technical question again, Kelly. If a company, the FSSC's certified to FSSC, and its product contains over 97% of water, I can imagine that there are also dairy products containing a lot of water, but would this part of the new additional requirement then be applied to water efficiency, water conservation? Because we're not talking about nutritional waste. So what would be your reply there?
Yeah, really good question. And it's overall holistically, food loss and waste needs to be applied to all organizations and all products that they produce besides packaging, like we mentioned earlier. So even if the organization is producing something with 97% water, they still need to consider what is their overall wastage, what other purpose could they use that for in order to generate less waste at the end of the day. So they would still need to look at implementing this requirement.
Okay, thanks a lot. Aldin, I think one final question for you, because we are close to 2 o'clock at the moment. Marcel de Vreese indicates that ISO is working on a separate management standard on food loss and waste, next to ISO 22000. Once published, would FSSC develop a separate scheme based on this new ISO standard? Or would food loss and waste still be part of FSSC 22000?
Interesting question. Thank you, Marcel, and nice hearing from you. Marcel is working for NE and the Dutch ISO member, Dutch Standardization Organization. And it's correct that in Denmark, Danish Standards has taken the lead to develop a management system standard for food loss and waste management. SC20, the group is called, and that process has started. We have joined this initiative as the foundation, being a liaison to that committee, because we want to monitor what's going on, obviously, in this important field. We have not taken the decision yet whether or not, when that standard will be published in a few years, that we will be launching a completely new certification scheme just on this topic. I do think that by that time we will have obviously a closer look at that standard. First, I would say we have to focus on our new baby, which we call FSSC 24000. So we have a lot of work to do to look at our social sustainability scheme and take that to the market and have companies like Friesland and others that already have an implemented and certified management system pick that one up and demonstrate we can also add value in other fields than food safety. And for the time being, we leave the food waste and loss and waste requirements in our food safety management system scheme. And I don't have a crystal ball, so I cannot look into the future, but that would be my answer for now.
Thanks a lot, Aldin. That brings us to the end of this webinar. We were not able to reply to all the questions, so please feel free to contact us on questions@fssc.com or reach out to our website, fssc.com. You can always submit questions through our website, and you can also submit your, download all the scheme documents for free on our website. Also, keep out an eye on our socials. There might be a follow-up on replying to Q&As from this webinar there. Thank you to all of you who joined this webinar. Hope to see you again on our next webinar that will be on the 30th of January on our FSSC 24,000 scheme for social sustainability. Thanks again. See you again.